Okay, welcome. Thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight's topic, this is the third of our spring garden series. So if you are just now joining us, this is your first time. My name is Courtney. I'm the horticulture educator for Cleveland County, Oklahoma. And I get to teach all these fun workshops related to gardening and horticulture, landscaping, taking care of the environment at home, all these great things. And so our garden series that we've been doing this early spring, really winter, but early spring, we can hope, is meant to be a beginning gardener session and introduce you to all aspects of gardening. And so tonight starts the first session of what is really a vegetable focused topic, as well as next week we will focus on veggies as well. So tonight we're going to talk about everything that we want to do before the plant gets into the ground. Because we've talked in the previous lessons, it's far more than just putting the plant in the ground and then waiting until you're ready for your harvest or your beautiful flowers. And so this is everything that you want to do to be proactive so that you have success along the way. So before we get started, couple things. Just a couple housekeeping items. If you could, please keep your microphone muted throughout the whole webinar. Just kind of helps us with a cohesive and peaceful experience. If you do have a question, please place that in the chat. Susan Erbach is my Zoom moderating buddy tonight, and we'll be monitoring that chat and making sure that any questions that pop up, I notice those. We'll pause periodically, so if you have questions, please feel free to throw them in there as well. We are recording tonight, so just keep that in mind. If you haven't already, please fill out the pre-assessment. That just helps us with getting a baseline of where everybody's at. And then two, after tonight, we will send out a post-assessment. And if you could please fill that out as well. Just really helps us show the difference between before and after the webinar, as well as keep improving these kinds of workshops. Another sort of slight maybe caveat is that I am in Cleveland County, Oklahoma. That's central Oklahoma. So if you are joining us from other parts of the state or the country, I will do my very best to answer any questions that you have. But my gardening experience is very centered around central Oklahoma. And then just a slight apology. I am at home this evening. Our internet at the office is rather spotty. And so if you hear my cat crying outside the door of this room, I apologize. He's very needy and wishes he was in here, but that wouldn't be good for anybody. So we will get started. So why bother having a vegetable garden? So when we sent out the poll, we were really about a 50-50 split for people who were already vegetable gardening. So if you haven't had a garden before, I'm glad you're here. This is the best place to start. And I'm glad that you're motivated. So I have just a couple of things up at the on the slide that talk about why it's important or why you would even want to bother having a garden. But I'd love to hear from you guys if you want to throw in the chat why do you like to garden? What motivates you? Of course, knowing where your food comes from, that's always great. I love being able to go outside and pick cherry tomatoes and be able to just eat those very quickly. I know everything that has been applied to those plants, how the soil was managed. Also makes you appreciate food a little bit more, I think. There are some foods that I would maybe not want to try and eat. So I'm not a huge radish fan, but gosh darn it, I will try to grow radishes every year. And when I have my radishes, I appreciate them so much more than if they were just store-bought food. So Megan said in the chat, watching my plants grow. Yes, that is so important. That's part of the mental health and of of watching that and having that reward, to be able to feel like I have nurtured something and been able to harvest it. Donna said fresh taste. Yes, better flavor. That's the next point. So those plants, we kind of tend to say like local and homegrown food, it tastes better. And there's some science behind that. But it's really the amount of time we have from when that plant was picked or that vegetable was picked to when we're able to eat it. And so if we're able to eat it pretty well off the plant right away, we are getting that plant in a very high amount of sugar and sweetness and acid and all those flavor compounds that we have. Yes, gardening is calming. Me too. Um, and then of course too, the physical health. So getting out there, bending up, being outside, and then appreciating our earth. Now, Anne said gardening is calming, but it can sometimes be frustrating, right? So sometimes we don't always have the success that we have planned. We really hope to we may have these grand ideas and we get a hailstorm, or we get 7 inches of rain in June, or we get absolutely no rain in July and August. And so it can be frustrating. And so that is part of tonight and the things that we can do in order to make it a more pleasant, calming experience. So this is kind of the layout for this evening for our steps to getting started in the garden. So if you've never started a garden before, you are brand new, this is sort of the process of which you want to go through. So you want to choose a spot. Choosing a good location for the garden is a very important part to getting right off on the best start. Then we want to clear the area, make sure there's no existing vegetation in that spot. If you're doing raised beds, you want to build that bed. Then you'll get your soil tested, acquire the seeds or plants that you're trying to start, and then schedule out your plantings. So we'll go through these in a little bit more depth. So when it comes to site selection, the ideal vegetable garden spot is going to have full sun in the morning and in the early afternoon. Now, if let's say that bed starts to get a little bit of shade, say around 3:30, that can even be a benefit in the summertime because we get really, really hot here in Oklahoma. So having a little reprieve from a little afternoon shade can be a good thing. But in all other seasons, you really want to have that be as full sun as possible. So I think someone in the pre-assessment mentioned wanting to know about plants that grow well in shade or do better in shade. That can be a challenge because most vegetables really do prefer full sun. You can get by with growing anything that's a non-fruiting or flowering crop in the shade, or in a little bit more shade. So that'd be things like your leafy greens. You could grow lettuce, spinach, things like that, as well as herbs. Those can be grown in the shade. But if you're growing watermelon, tomato, okra, any of those things that are going to be very strong fruiting crops, so they flower and then they fruit and then you pick the fruit, those do need full sun. So you also want to avoid slopes in your when you're selecting that site. So you want it to be a nice level, even area. The reason for that, of course, is if you're watering or amending with fertilizer, compost, whatever, and you're putting all that work into that one spot, if you get a heavy rain, all that soil, it can erode and we lose all that effort that we put in to that spot. So if you have a very sloped backyard, I know a lot of new developments have smaller backyards and they may drop off. Trying to terrace that as best you can is going to be really help you in the long run. Having a sloped vegetable garden will be a challenge. And then if possible, you want to keep that garden at least 2 times the distance of a tree drip line. You want to keep it about 2 times away of that drip line from a tree. So if you think about the canopy of a tree, multiply by that by 2, you want your vegetable garden to be outside of that. The reason for that is because trees are very uh, adventitious, and their tree roots will begin to get into your raised beds, and those real small tree roots will be after that water, after any fertilizer you put in there. And so they you will be fighting that and fighting those trees, and you'll have this unnecessary competition. Now, I totally get it. We have small backyards sometimes, and if there's a big tree, you just want to keep it as far away as possible from that tree, um, just to help yourself out with that competition. It's just a best practice. So after you choose a spot for the garden, you want to clear the area. And if you're in Oklahoma, what you are likely clearing out is Bermuda grass. It is our most popular turf grass in our area. And we, as gardeners, we tend to speak poorly of Bermuda grass, but it is a very good turf grass. And the reason for that is it spreads by rhizomes. So those are underground root structures. It spreads by stolons, which are above ground structures. And it can also spread by seed if those seed are able to spread. And so because of that, it creates a nice thick canopy, and that thick canopy then can stand compaction, it can stand traffic. And so it's a very good turf grass. It's a very annoying weed in a vegetable garden. And so as much as we can, we want to try and control the Bermuda grass and get that out of there so that we can not have to fight it later. So whatever you do to control Bermuda grass, whatever strategy you want to take, it can be a good idea to mow that Bermuda grass down really low before attempting to control it. And so essentially this is kind of a two-prong approach. So we stress it out by taking away the majority of its canopy, and then we come in with whatever control we so choose based on our gardening preferences. So a couple things that we can do. One of the easiest ways is to mulch that vegetation. This picture here is when I was in a rental house, and so pretend that's a nice luscious backyard turf grass. But what you would do is you would mow that Bermuda grass down and then lay something on top of it that smothers it to keep it from photosynthesizing and getting energy and actively growing. And so whatever you put on top of it, we want to leave that for about 6 to 8 weeks during the active Bermuda grass growing season. And that will really help smother it out. So a couple options you can use like a black plastic, trash bags, things like that. That's not going to break down if you use plastic. So a good recommendation is to either use cardboard or maybe a wood chip mulch. Because the cool thing about that is if you do that and then you stick soil on top of it, those items will begin to break down, and you have suppression at the same time. So you don't have to wait. So if you're building up on top of it, kind of like that bed there, that's what I was doing as I was laying out plastic and newspaper, and then filled with a soil mix there on top. Word of caution, if you're using like shipping boxes or anything, that take the plastic plant label or the plastic box labels off. I didn't even do that in this picture, but you should, because you'll be pulling those out of the ground later as you're digging and gardening in your new bed. You can also solarize the area. So it's similar in a way to mulching in that we're covering that spot, but we're also steaming and essentially cooking the grass. So you can use a clear plastic and place that over an area. You want to water really heavily before you do this, and essentially that adds a bit of water to the soil profile. And then as you cover it, with a clear plastic during a hot time of the year, you end up with a steam, creating steam in the soil, which essentially then cooks the grass and any weed seeds in that soil. And so mention this a little bit, but you want to do this during June to August. You want to do it during the hottest times of the year. If you were to do it right now, it wouldn't be super effective because it's not super hot outside. Mulching would be a better option right now. And this typically takes about 4 to 6 weeks to start to see a good clearing of the dead Bermuda grass under there. If you choose to use chemical controls, those can be effective. I have glyphosate on here, but a lot of the companies have actually changed the formulation. So glyphosate was the active ingredient in Roundup, but a lot of they've changed to a couple different active ingredients in Roundup, but basically they're all non-selective herbicides or mixes of herbicides that would act as non-selective. And so if you choose to do that, it can be very effective, but a cautionary note, you absolutely want to read the label on any product that you're putting out there. It's going to give you instructions on what to wear, what temperature to use it, what kind of equipment you can use, and it's going to give you instructions on how to use that product in the most safe manner possible. And so you have to, it's really, those labels are the law, but you have to follow those instructions. So just please do that. There are organic chemical controls, and so they are act as an herbicide, but they are organically derived. So things like acetic acid and vinegar. I think a couple of like essential oil mixes are on the market. But the thing to keep in mind with these is that a lot of times they're only really going to burn the top. So those non-organic synthetic herbicides, they are systemic and they will be absorbed by the plant and carried through the plant, whereas these organic ones are really just burning the top of the plant. So they're contact herbicides. And so whatever they touch burns and then dies. So all this to say is that it's typically not going to be a one and done approach. You might want to use this and then go with another approach like mulching, or do it multiple times. So just keep that in mind. I also see a lot of DIY recipes on the internet for weed killers. And I recommend avoiding these because they don't necessarily come with a set of instructions. And there may be times where we're going into the kitchen cabinet. If we're going into the kitchen cabinet and we're making DIY mixtures, we may make something that's actually more toxic than what's on the shelves. So if you want to use an organic herbicide, look into a vinegar product or an essential oil-based product. Please don't go mixing random things in the kitchen. It can be more dangerous sometimes. And then, of course, there's hand pulling, which is very labor intensive and can be exhausting. But the good thing, of course, about hand pulling is it's very effective if you're thorough. And so make sure you're pulling out all the rhizomes in the soil, all the stolons, any of that debris that you see, to make sure that the plants don't necessarily come back. And of course, the good thing about hand pulling is too, you can do it any time of year. So you could go out right now and hand pull. So worth mentioning. There is a super cool OSU fact sheet on turf eradication. So I just kind of think it's funny. The turf department did a couple turf specialists did an experiment on the best way to kill turf. But Casey Hinch is the host of Oklahoma Gardening, helped with this too. And if you're an avid Oklahoma Gardening watcher, you probably saw this. But they tested a whole lot of different chemical products, as well as some of the more mechanical ways that we talked about, like the mulching and the solarization, and evaluated what was the most effective, what were the pros and cons. And so they did compile that into a fact sheet. And so if you are interested in that information and doing a deeper dive, go check that out. So I'll pause here. Any questions on what we've covered so far? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to keep going. So you've cleared the area and now it is time to build a raised bed if you so choose. So raised beds are great. Um, Especially, I mean, if you're trying to sell at a farmer's market and you have a very large area of land, it may not be as effective. But if you're a backyard gardener, raised beds can really hold a lot of benefits. And so you're able to squeeze more plants into that area, so it's a bit more efficient, and by that you get higher yields. You can amend the soil, create a soil that is better suited for vegetable production instead of trying to grow into straight Oklahoma native soil. You tend to get better water conservation because that amended soil may hold more water. And then because of those plants being more packed in there, you may have less pressure with weeds. You can add season extension, so like little low tunnels, kind of like a hoop house, to that as well. And then also you can have a little bit better pest control too, really because when you're growing in a raised bed, you're not necessarily planting in rows like you would in a production system. You're mixing lots of things in together, and that diversity really helps with that better pest control. Um, so even if you're not growing in like a contained raised bed, raising the elevation of that soil can still add some benefits. So just kind of mounding it up. And they really, while it's not maybe a traditional raised bed that we might picture, in a commercial vegetable setting, they still sort of bed that soil up, so that they can get some of those benefits of water conservation and things like that. So typically about 6 to 8 inches high with sides that taper off, that can be beneficial that can get you some of those benefits of a raised bed without having to construct an actual hardscape style structure. And then these typically, I mean, they're not going to necessarily last. So you would just need to sort of reshape them at the beginning of each season. So if you are laying out a new raised bed, typically you'll see a lot of times a 4 by 8 foot, but you can really go as long as you want that raised bed to be. But the thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to go wider than 4 feet. And so wider than 4 feet, that's because your arm, I'm moving my arm out here, but you can't see. Your arms are really only about 2 feet long. And so that way you can reach into the bed without having to step into that bed and compact and cause any issues without having to stomp around in there. So you can always reach into it. So you can go as long as you want, but don't go wider than 4 feet. You want to place that raised bed in a north-south orientation. And somebody in the pre-assessment asked about arches. This would apply to arches as well. You want to, the north-south orientation helps because when the sun comes up in the east, then the majority of that bed there is exposed to the sun, and it will get, that will help evaporate the dew and any water left on those plants, which will help with disease prevention. And so it kind of sort of warms up that raised bed or those plants in that area as best you can. And then you want to put your taller plants there on, really that says the north side, but I really think I mean the west side. That way everything is exposed so you can get max so that it can dry up rather quickly and you don't have water sitting on the plant, which will cause diseases. So two, when building a raised bed, you can go as high as you really want to. But if you go at least 6 inches, that's going to really help you with the drainage. And so give you enough soil profile that soil that you've mixed and amended is going to be well suited, and it will be deep enough for the roots to really be able to utilize that. If you want to be able to sit on the edge of the raised bed and work in it, that can sometimes be very pleasant. About 18 to 24 inches can be can be a sweet spot. You can go very high if you want to, but it can sometimes get expensive trying to fill that much depth. So at least 6 inches to get those benefits. So talking about construction materials, we want to look into untreated hardwood. And so probably in our area, cedar is going to be the easiest to find, but you can also use black locust, Osage orange, redwood, oak. Those all would work well. You want to avoid pressure treated wood or railroad ties. Those have chemicals that have been applied to them that have the potential to soak into the soil. Now, when looking at pressure treated wood, you may see now the chemicals that are used to treat pressure treated wood are actually a lot less toxic than they used to be. So it used to be that chromated copper arsenate, so that was an arsenic based product. But now it's this, I'm just going to say MCQ, but it's a copper based product. So it still has some copper in it and it wouldn't be considered organic, but it's far less toxic than it used to be. Plants are much more sensitive to copper than we will ever be. So you can get by with using it because it's going to be in such small, minute amounts. I just mentioned that because it tends to be a bit cheaper. But that's totally up to you, your preferences, and budget needs. But I just want to mention that. So we want it to be, when selecting wood, you want it to at least be about 2 inches thick, and you can use 3 inches galvanized screws to secure that. That's just one suggestion. There's a lot of different types of brackets, things like that, that you can look into building wood raised beds. You can also use masonry materials like cement blocks, bricks, concrete. Those are options. Sometimes in some cement blocks, there can be potential heavy metals mixed into the concrete. So just be aware of that. Maybe look into whatever source it is that you're buying from. You can stack them, of course, to get depth, but if you're not using mortar really more than 2, you're gonna start to put pressure on that. It's gonna be kind of a little bit of a mess. And then 2, using mortar, that will make it more permanent, but there are some additives in cement mix that would be considered inorganic and not qualify it as what's considered certified organic. So somebody mentioned garden blocks with untreated for 2x4 that I seal with Fuga. So that's what you use? That's cool. I'm curious, is this kind of what it is, your setup? So these are super cool. So you don't have to do any sort of, yeah, awesome. Okay. So you don't have to do any construction. They're basically these little, they're cement blocks that have, you can slide boards into them. And then those are the corners. Ah, cool. This is also what Megan uses. So yes, and this is readily available at the garden stores. So also an option. Going back a little bit. Okay. So, and you can stack as high as you want. Yes. So there are also just a ton of kits out there. I think I see a new one at Costco every weekend. But they're readily available, easy to construct. Sometimes they're very pretty. Sometimes they can be expensive. It's just totally up to what you want to do. I will mention, I don't think I have necessarily a bullet point on it, but the galvanized like troughs that sometimes are popular, just be cautious. Those can get very, very hot. And so they may require more watering. Or something like this in the photo that's raised up like that. That's great if you have struggles bending down or don't want to bend down. But that can also dry out fairly quickly with it being up above the ground. Container growing. So I sent out the in the pre-assessment, most people who were gardening were using raised beds, but there were a few people who were doing container gardening, which can be very fun and easy if you don't have a whole lot of space. Or maybe you're in an apartment with a balcony, you can absolutely have a pot with some veggies on your balcony. So thing to keep in mind, in a raised bed, we have some flexibility in what we can use to amend the soil. But in a container, you need to use what we call a soilless media or potting mix, basically. So it's not going to have any real soil in it. So it's going to be fluffier, lighter, and that tends to be, if you use something with real soil in it, it's going to be too heavy and hold on to too much water. So you want to use a soilless media. And seed companies, knowing that container gardening has grown in popularity, have started making more containerized based varieties, or varieties that are better, that are small, compact, and better for containers. So that is that's an option. I've seen, patio tomatoes have been around for a while, but I've seen container corn. That's pretty cool. I don't know if it's very easy to grow or not, but if you'd be very effective with it, but it's something to try. So I keep in mind too, sometimes, oh, how do you sanitize the pot? Okay, I'm going to do this point and then I will answer your question. So when you have a pot, you don't want to necessarily, sometimes I see it's recommended to put rocks at the bottom of that pot because it's going to help with drainage. That actually impedes drainage because water, as it moves through that profile, it doesn't like to move. It has to fully saturate that top layer before it will start to move down to the bottom layer where there are rocks. And so you end up basically kind of pushing the water up, and the roots sit in water more often for longer periods of time. So I don't recommend putting rocks in the bottom of your pots. It does not help with drainage. It hurts. And then before using pots again, you should sanitize them. I mentioned, so in the picture, I have like a pretty little terracotta ceramic pot. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to sanitize your ceramic pots because that surface isn't, the surface is porous and it will be very, very hard to sanitize. But you do want to sanitize any plastic. So if you're using like 5-gallon buckets or mineral cube buckets, that's a popular one. You want to sanitize it. So clean it, clean that, and then use a 10% bleach solution. So that's 1 part bleach, 9 part water together, and you can sanitize it that way. So that's what you can also do that too with, like, if you're pruning and you're worried about diseases on your pruners, that's a good option to sanitize. That's typically enough bleach to kill any pathogens, any diseases that are there. And diseases are more likely to hang out and spread on the non-porous surface of plastic than they are other materials. And then I think I saw question. So does it matter if, yes, you want to use a food safe, food grade material. So if it's something that once had food in it, like I think using big pickle, 5-gallon buckets of pickles or soy sauce or anything like that. If it was like paint or fertilizer, I would not, you want it to be a food safe plastic. Yes, and then Pat says lettuce, spinach, chard grow well in containers. This is true. Lots of leafy greens can be grown in containers. Okay, this is another option. And if you have been in the, if you are using Smart Pots, let me know in the chat because I love Smart Pots. This is an Oklahoma company. They're basically a fabric container that you can use to grow as a container. There's something in the technology of the fabric that root prunes and kind of helps the plants from circulating and girdling themselves with their roots. So that I would definitely check out some smart pots. I like to grow, my favorite thing to grow in smart pots are potatoes, because when I'm ready to harvest, I can just dump the smart pot instead of having to dig up anything. Andrea asked about metal water troughs. Mentioned this a couple of slides ago, but you can use metal watering troughs. The cautionary note is that they just get very hot. And so that metal collects a lot of heat in the summertime. And so you may have to be watering more often. Do they need to be sanitized? Yeah, I would sanitize them because that's a non-porous surface. And yes, the smart pots are reusable. I would just let them dry out. You can sort of wash them off. Can't really necessarily sanitize them, but replacing the soil will be some sanitation. Okay, I'll pause again. I know you guys are asking great questions, so if you have any more, throw them in the chat before. Okay. Seeing none. Okay, so the next step, get your soil tested and amend based on recommendations. So if you are growing in a raised bed and you've mostly used like a topsoil product to fill that raised bed, you want to get that tested. We talked about this last week, and so I won't spend too much time on it. But I will also say that if you're growing in containers and you're using a non-soil mixture for your production, we have a separate test for that. It's called the greenhouse media test. It's $20 instead of 10, but we can still get nutrients that are in your soil. Okay, so we're going to consider that one that we talked about. So next, picking out varieties. It can be overwhelming to pick out varieties, especially when you're getting all of these seed catalogs in the mail and they've got all these pretty pictures and you're like, I want to grow 87 different varieties of squash, but I don't have room for 87 varieties of squash. So how do you choose? How do you narrow that down? So couple places to go check out for picking the varieties. OSU, of course, we have a fact sheet for that. Vegetable varieties for Oklahoma. I will say that this fact sheet is really the tried and true varieties that do well in Oklahoma. You can also visit All American Selections, and so that's an organization that trials vegetable varieties all throughout the country. And if they do well in the trial gardens, then they recommend them as an all-American selection. So you can go to their website, see what it all that they have grown, and they will also take you to places to go buy that seed. So that's nice. And then OSU also does local trials. So they will do variety vegetable trials in different parts of the state. The thing here to keep in mind is that they don't try every variety of every vegetable every year. They may just pick a couple crops. And so one year might be tomatoes, asparagus, watermelon. And so you may have to kind of go back and see if you're looking for a particular crop to see how they did. I know that the vegetable specialist at OSU has done 2 years of garlic trials, and it's the first time we've ever done garlic variety trials in Oklahoma. So when you're picking out varieties, a couple things to consider as you're trying to filter through those 87 varieties that you want to grow. So look into disease resistance. Disease resistance is really the first defense against diseases. And so having a variety that has disease resistance built into it can be very helpful. And so that would be listed in seed catalogs showing you which varieties. You'll also notice heirloom versus hybrids. So hybrids, they aren't necessarily, hybrids are not GMOs, but they have two different parents. And so those two different parents were bred together, and then the next generation is what we are growing. And so they may select a parent that has really big fruit but poor disease resistance, and then they might pick another parent that has not so great fruit but great disease resistance, and then they crossbreed those together, and then the seed saved from that becomes the hybrids that we're growing. Now, the thing to keep in mind with hybrids is we can't save seeds from hybrid varieties. Well, you can, but it's going to be a mixed genetic bag of what you get. And so the genetics in the next generation, if you save that seed, they will, the genetics scramble, and you may end up with something completely different than what that previous generation was that you were growing. Now, if you want to save seeds and be able to come back year after year with the same variety, then you want to choose an heirloom variety. And so their genetics are very, very stable. And if you save seed from them, you can essentially get the same variety year after year by saving seed. I mention that too because sometimes I see it on the internet to go to the grocery store and cut open a tomato and then plant that tomato. That would be considered hybrids, and you would not know what you're getting. So don't do that unless you just want to experiment. So pelleted seeds, that's what's in this picture here. It's kind of a clay material that is coated around the seed, and that really helps with planting. And so some of our seeds are so tiny, it's hard to handle with planting, and we may overseed in some spots. So pelleted seeds really help with that. They're a bit more expensive, but that's kind of on a large scale. So I think one time I bought 2 packets of tomato seeds. One was pelleted, one wasn't. They were both $3. The pelleted seed packet had 15 seeds, and the non-pelleted had over 200 seeds. I got bored and stopped counting after that. So both $3, but I don't need over 200 tomato plants. So it's just something to keep in mind. You can also get organic seed, so that's just to mean it hasn't been treated with any fungicides. And so those are all some things to consider, but I will always recommend trying to do some experimentation for yourself. You never know what's gonna surprise you, and that's the joy of gardening. And so give yourself a little bit of the garden to have some fun with an experiment, because there are a lot of really cool varieties out there. So different colors of tomatoes. I think you can get every vegetable in purple these days. So purple okra, purple cauliflower, purple potatoes. You can get everything in purple. That's that picture there in the bottom center is Malabar spinach, which is a vining crop. It's a warm season plant that takes that when you cook it really tastes like spinach. And so spinach being a cool season, you can kind of get some spinach in the summertime. Of course, Romanesco, never had luck with it. If you have, I'm jealous, but it is a very beautiful type of cauliflower. So always give yourself a little bit of room to experiment. That's the joy and the fun. So when getting vegetables started, you want to, different vegetables can be started different ways. Transplants, we want to, of course, our peppers and tomatoes, it's easiest to transplant those, as well as cole crops. And so that's going to be our broccoli, cauliflower, kale, things like that. Cuttings, we start sweet potatoes with vegetative cuttings. And so that's that picture there on the bottom right. It's a really little cuttings of sweet potato leaves, and they eventually grow some sweet potatoes. With Irish potatoes or white potatoes, we start with seed pieces. So that's cut up pieces of the actual potato. With other vegetables, we want to start them with seed. They're better off started by seed. So that's going to include any root veggie. So carrots, radishes, beets, things like that. We don't want to transplant those because essentially what we'd be doing is disturbing the part that we're trying to harvest. And so once we plant that, we want to keep it where it's at. Also the legumes. So that's beans and peas, as well as corn, okra. Those are all easily started by seed. And then if you're growing asparagus, which is really our only perennial vegetable that we can grow in Oklahoma, that is crowns, which are essentially kind of an underground structure. So if you're out shopping, looking for vegetable transplants, couple things to keep in mind. Picking those healthy transplants, we want it to make sure it's free of any diseases. So if it's in a nice greenhouse and it's getting lots of water and the wind's not too harsh and the temperature is regulated and it has diseases, that's not going to get any better if you put it out in your vegetable garden. So make sure it's nice and healthy. You also want it to have a well-developed root system. So actually pop your plants out of the pots. Make sure that root ball holds together. If it's sort of falling apart on you, it's too young to transplant. If you pop it out and it's a huge mass bundle of roots, it's been in that pot too long. So we want a nice healthy balance. That root ball stays together, but it's not a huge mass of roots.
Hey, Courtney.
Yes, Susan.
We had a question about asparagus in Oklahoma. Is asparagus better in a dedicated greenhouse? Is that better to be outside or inside?
Oh, thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. So question on asparagus in a greenhouse. Asparagus needs the temperature regulation that we have from the exposed temperature. So I wouldn't necessarily grow asparagus in a greenhouse. We want it to be able to go dormant in the fall and winter so that we can mow it back. Also, we wouldn't want to grow asparagus asparagus would really need to be grown in the ground so that is nice and protected. So I wouldn't grow asparagus in a greenhouse. But if you've done it and had success, let me know. Hopefully that answered your question. So also too on healthy transplants, we want to make sure it's not too leggy. And so that's when they get stretched. So that's they're looking for the light and they're growing and they're topping over. And we also want to make sure that when we're picking out transplants, they don't have flowers or fruit because typically at that stage, they're too young to have flowers or fruit. Okay, so clarification, I was thinking of in-ground, inside, greenhouse on north wall. I say try it. If it's in the ground and you're not overly heating the greenhouse, like if the greenhouse still had some temperature fluctuations and it was able to go dormant, or if you imposed dormancy by maybe cutting back on watering, worth a try. But definitely keeping it in ground would be important because it's a perennial. Okay. And then if you plan to grow transplants at home, I will admit growing transplants at home is a workshop within itself. Light's going to be your limiting factor. You really need to have some kind of supplemental lighting when growing transplants at home. You can't just stick them in a window. House plants will do fine, but vegetable transplants need quite a bit more light. So you can grow lights are they're pretty inexpensive, but just keep in mind that sometimes even so for example, I bought one of those 3-prong LED grow lights. I think it was just off Amazon, $30. It still wasn't enough light, so I'm having to double up on it. So just keep that in mind. Light's going to be your limiting factor. You also want to make sure the soil is kept consistently moist, but not overly moist when growing those transplants. We also want to make sure it's not too cold. So if you have it in a drafty room or up against a window, can also be an issue. And then two, of course, we have a fact sheet on that. So if you want more information, go check out that fact sheet. Also, if you purchase seed packets, there's going to be a lot of information on that seed packet. But a couple things to highlight. So days to maturity is important because especially if you're trying to time your harvests. Like, let's say you really want to be able to have a food at a certain time or a harvest at a certain time. And this can be very important in fall gardening when you're up against the first freeze. Look at those days to maturity. Other important thing to point out is plant spacing. And so you'll see that the recommended plant spacing on a seed packet. A lot of times you might see between row and within row. And if you're doing a square foot gardening system where you're planting on a grid rather than in rows, you can ignore the between row spacing and just use the within row spacing for your grids. So that's something you could try. And then also if you're growing vegetables, vegetable transplants, or even just bringing them home, it's a good idea to harden them off. I often make the analogy, it's like when you have teenagers at home and you want them to start doing more things so that when they move out, they're a bit more sufficient. That is essentially hardening off your plants. So what you can do is you can stick them outside on warm days. If it's a cold, that way they're getting used to the Oklahoma sun, the wind, things like that. You can also cut back on watering, fertilizing, but then my favorite is you can brush them. So you can pet your transplants and that mimics wind and that hardens up their stems so that they are more resilient when you put them outside. So we've gone shopping, we have our plants, we are ready to get planting, and we want to schedule out our plantings. And so, of course, we have we group our vegetables into cool and warm seasons, and they don't grow well if you plant them in their wrong season. So our cool season, we're about to enter into the cool season. I think Farmer's Almanac says you can plant onions on Valentine's Day. I'm gonna wait because it's cold. But we're kind of at the cusp of our cool season, and then we have a cool season in the fall. And then we have one big warm season around in the summertime. But of course, Oklahoma and other places as well, they don't necessarily always follow the calendar on when the seasons transition. So timing that can sometimes be a little bit of a gamble. So won't spend too much time on this because this is the bulk of next week, but we have our cool season veggies, so the leafy greens, cole crops, bulb crops, our cool season legumes, root crops, and our white or Irish potatoes. And then our warm season veggies, which include sweet corn, okra, the solanaceous or the nightshade fruits, and so that includes tomato, pepper, eggplant, tomatillo. We have our warm season legumes like beans and cowpeas, and then we have our cucurbit vines, which include squash, zucchini, cucumber, cantaloupe, watermelon, and pumpkin. And so we will talk about each of these veggies in more detail next Thursday. And so too, if you're trying to decide when to plant, we have the two great fact sheets that cover that information, the Oklahoma Garden Planning Guide. So that's very specific to this time of year. So it has the first cool season and the warm season planting dates. And then we have fall gardening fact sheet that helps with trying to time the plantings before we have that freeze. So Pat asked, can you plant onions and okra in the same bed for a couple of years? So this is getting into something we'll talk about next week, but you absolutely want to, as best you can, rotate where you're planting certain crops. So crop rotation is going to be a best practice in rotating that. It helps with less stress on the soil and less pressure from diseases and insects, because they eventually learn that that's where it is. If you do it like 2 years in a row, I don't know that it's going to be too bad, but it's a best practice to rotate as best you can. And definitely avoid planting the same thing in the same spot year after year after year. So that can be something to avoid. Okay, also on deciding when to plant. I think From Seed to Spoon has updated their logo, so I should update my slides. But this is a fantastic app. It is free. And you can put your zip code in and it will give you recommendations on when to plant based on where you're at. It's also a very little nifty app too, because it gives advice on the crops and certain insects to watch out for. So they have a very robust Facebook social media presence, and so would check that out as well. Okay, so to wrap up this evening, it's very satisfying to have a garden. I hope you feel that way. And being proactive, choosing a good site, building a good bed, cleaning out that existing vegetation, and picking healthy varieties, all help with that proactive measures so that we can have success along the way. So a couple resources. I feel like I sound like a broken record, but check out our fact sheet website, as well as here are some relevant fact sheets. A couple of these we've already mentioned. So I see another question in the chat. Are there veggies like asparagus that need a dedicated bed? No. So asparagus is really the only perennial vegetable that we can grow in Oklahoma. So it would stay in that one spot and continue to come back year after year. Now, we're talking about vegetables, and it's not really considered a vegetable, but strawberries um, tend to be, we tend to garden strawberries more like we would a vegetable, but strawberries would be another perennial that we would want to give its own dedicated space. Beyond that, looking at perennial crops, you're going to start to get on into like the brambles or more fruit type crops. So the blueberries, the blackberries, figs, things like that. Blueberries need a very low soil pH, so they would need their own designated spot. But when we're talking about veggies, asparagus is really the only ornamental that would need a dedicated space. Darlene asked, is there a fact sheet on companion planting? We don't have a fact sheet on companion planting. A lot of companion planting, there's not a whole lot of research-based information out there about companion planting. But what I can say about companion planting is that it's the more diversity that you have in your garden, the better. So not planting all your tomatoes in one bed or not planting all your squash in one bed and mixing in herbs and flowers to bring in pollinators. So having that diversity is going to be really the key when it comes to companion planting. But we don't have a designated fact sheet. I will say if you are in the Cleveland County area on March, I think it's the 15th, the third Saturday of March, one of our master gardeners will be teaching a science-based companion planting class at the well. So I'm excited for that because she has a resource that's done a book that's done a lot of research and resource on science-based companion planting. I'll also mention if there are still people on, just another plug, if you are in the Cleveland County area on next Saturday, February 22nd at the well, we will be having a backyard homesteading conference. It's our third annual backyard homesteading conference. And two of the topics, I'll be teaching seed starting, and then my agricultural counterpart, Brad Seacraw, will be teaching sweet potatoes. And we'll also have honeybees and food preservation. So if that's if you're interested in that, call the office or shoot me an email and we can get you registered for that. It's going to pretty much be in the afternoon, 11 to 4:30, and it is $30. And that includes lunch and snacks. That is, I'll put it in the chat. How about that? February 22nd at the well from 11:30 to 4:30. And if you want to email me or call me, we can get you more information and get you signed up for that. Any other questions? I will send out the recording and the PowerPoint tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow morning. And as well as the post assessment. If you could please fill that out, that just helps us have some metrics and improves our programming. So seeing no other questions, I hope to see you all next week for Garden to Grub, we'll be talking about things to do after you put the plants in, and then each individual veggie crop. I call it veggie speed dating. So I hope to see you for that. Have a lovely evening.